The Lumad present accumulation by disposition. Carl Gaspar's The Lumad's struggle in the face of globalization argues that the marginalization and dispossession of the Lumad people in the Philippines are deeply rooted in the historical legacies of colonialism and neo-colonialism. These systems created during enduring powerlessness despite promises of people power and continue to impact the Lumad today, necessitating a fundamental challenge to existing social and economic structures. Today, I am summarizing the concept of accumulation by disposition. This theory argues that the growth of wealth in capitalism isn't just about creating new things. It often involves taking resources and assets that from others. Think of neo-colonialism, where powerful countries still influence weaker ones economically and politically, benefiting local elites at the expense of the majority. The core idea developed by thinkers like David Harvey is that when there's too much capital and not enough profitable places to invest, it seeks new frontiers to exploit for cheaper resources. This leads to disposition, taking land, labor, and other assets from those who already have them. This happens through various means, like privatizing communal lands, turning resources into commodities, and even suppressing traditional ways of life. Historically, colonialism was a major driver of this. Even today, these processes continue through things like debt, land grabbing, and global market pressures driven by powerful institutions and nations. The struggles of indigenous communities like the Lumad in Mindanao can be seen as a contemporary example of this, where the drive for resources leads to displacement and conflict. Essentially, accumulation by disposition highlights how the wealth of some can be directly linked to the loss of others, often facilitated by state power and global economic forces. The next part of the text even suggests that state-sponsored violence can be a tool for this disposition. So in short, capitalist growth often has a dark side. It can be fueled by taking from others, both historically and in the present day.
Disposition through state-sponsored wars of extension. The concept of accumulation by disposition, explained by Marx and Harvey, is clearly demonstrated in the experience of the Lumad in Mindanao. Their lands and way of life have been systematically eroded through state-sponsored mechanisms designed to integrate Mindanao into the global capitalist economy. Central to this process was the Philippine state's resettlement programs, initially imposed during colonial rule and continued under elite-led democracy. These programs displaced indigenous communities to make way for migrant settlers, an economic project aligned with capitalist interests. The state enforced this shift through the deployment of police and military forces, which often originated from settler communities and consistently sided with migrants against indigenous resistance. The establishment of state governance structures also undermined traditional Lumad political systems. This imposition backed by violence and systematic marginalizations represents an ongoing war of extension against Lumad, erasing their autonomy, culture, and access to ancestral lands in favor of dominant political and economic powers.
The Lumad and accumulation by disposition. Marginalization of the Lumad people or indigenous groups in Mindanao through a concept called accumulation by disposition. This refers to how powerful groups, often from the state or corporations, take land and resources from indigenous communities for profit without fair compensation or regard for the people living there. Carl Gaspar's argument. In his book, The Lumad Struggle in the Face of Globalizations, Gaspar explains how the Lumad's current struggles can be traced to colonial and neo-colonial histories. These systems created political and economic structures that disempowered indigenous peoples. Even after major political events like the 1986 People Power Revolution, the Lumad remain powerless and exploitation continues. Neo-colonialism. This term describes how even after independence, the country is still controlled by foreign and elite local interests. These interests dominate the economy, government, and land ownership, keeping marginalized groups like the Lumad at a disadvantage. Accumulation by disposition by David Harvey's theory. Harvey explains that capitalism needs to keep expanding and finding new resources. When capital or wealth can't be profitably reinvested, it looks for cheap resources in less powerful areas, often taking land or displacing people. In the Philippines, this means rural and indigenous lands are taken for development or mining, often without consent or fair benefit to the locals. This system keeps the Lumad in a cycle of poverty and disempowerment. Despite promises of democracy and development, economic and political structures continue to favor the elite, pushing indigenous communities further into
Continuous of the political structures established during the Spanish colonial era in the Philippines, particularly under the American rule. It argues that the Americans utilized existing landlord class to maintain control and implement their policies, resulting in a neo-colonial state post-World War II. The economic framework of feudalism persisted, with the landlord-tenant relationship remaining intact. Contrary the expectation of modernization, Simbalon highlights that this relationship facilitated a political dynamic where a few powerful elites, the bosses, maintained authority over the border populations, fostering a culture of bosom, rooted the historical relationship. This dichotomy influenced the political landscape, leading to the hierarchical understanding of leadership and social relationship in the Philippine society.
Mindanao has been taken advantage of the powerful people in the Philippines. They give control for its natural resources to their friends, big companies, and local strongmen. For example, logging, mining, and big farms like Busco push out indigenous peoples like Manubu in their lands. Big projects like Agos hydropower plants also force people to leave, especially the Maranao. Even though the 1987 Constitution said it would protect indigenous rights, it's also said that all natural resources belong to the government. This went against the idea that indigenous people already own their ancestral lands. The scholar named Rudil said, A scholar named Rudil said, ignore the fact that indigenous people had lived on their shared this land for a very long time. In 1997, a new law called Indigenous People Rights, or APRA law, was passed. This finally recognized the rights of indigenous peoples. It made sure that they have to say through free priors and informed consent, or FPIC, before the project happened on their land. And they also get help from the indigenous agency called Natural Commissions of Indigenous People, or NCPI.
And human rights violation nearly 2 decades after its implementation. The state's failure to guarantee their full enjoyment of human rights and freedoms has resulted in ongoing social, political, and economic hardships. Instruments of marginalization. Instead of providing redress, the EPRA law and its mechanism have been misused to further marginalize indigenous communities. This misuse has contributed to increased incidents of extrajudicial killings and forced evacuations on indigenous leaders and their communities. The laws intended protection has become to tools of operation, NCIP's ineffectiveness and corruption. The National Commission of Indigenous Peoples, NCIP, has demonstrated inadequate implementation of the IPRA law, particularly regarding the free, prior, and informed consent principles. Studies reveal poor informed and indications of corruption within the FAIC process, particularly concerning mining and business certification in indigenous areas. This weakness undermines the intended safeguards for indigenous lands and rights. Deadly consequences of EFRA misuse. Killing of indigenous leaders like Jimmy Ligoyon and Nicasio Precioso highlight the deadly consequences of the EFRA laws. Corruption. Paramilitary groups often backed by the military and business utilize the law to claim an ancestral lands, leading to violence against those who resist. This action demonstrates the stark failure of the law's protection mechanism. Widespread abuse across Mindanao. Across Mindanao, large businesses with military backing utilize the IPRA law to sponsor fraudulent ancestral domain claims. This action, coupled with the NCIP's complicity or inaction, have resulted in widespread murder and displacement of indigenous communities. The law's intended spirit of consent is routinely violated. IPRA laws corruption. The IPRA laws, initially designed to protect indigenous groups, has been corrupted by political and economic force. It has become a tool used by those its wide intention to protect indigenous communities from leading to their continuous displacement and suffering. This demonstrates how even progressive legislation can be subverted within a corruption system.